Okay, so the recording is started and my screen is being shared. That's great. I'll get a few things lined up in front of me. And the first thing I'm going to do this morning before I start saying anything is I'm going to share the deck for today in the chat for you. So you're welcome to play along at your own speed. And we'll start talking a little bit about today's training. So for those that don't know me, my name's Lachlan Kalish. I'm the Learning Innovation Lead within the Division of Learning and Teaching. And I'm involved in the Brightspace rollout. I'm part of the change management team. And I'm joined this morning in the training session by Amy Martin, who's also part of the same team. Amy will be my co-pilot today. She'll point to the exits on the plane as we crash into the ocean, etc. But no, Amy's here to help facilitate any questions you've got going on in the chat and also to pull me up if I'm missing any of the dialogue going on. We don't really stand on ceremony as such in these sessions. If you've got burning questions that you need answered, put them in the chat in the first instance or raise your hand. I will be stopping periodically, both to get a sip of water, etc., take a breath, but also to find out what people are thinking about where we're up to. The sessions that we're running around Brightspace are broken up quite intentionally, and today even more so because we're actually splitting what we sometimes deliver as a 2-hour block for the ADAPT training session is split into A and B. And I will give you a look at what that looks like in just a moment. But we are in the ADAPT sessions for Brightspace training, which really focus on the migration of content material coming across from Blackboard, from Interact 2, and the process that's involved in proofing those materials, validating those materials, adding additional materials, and by and large, just getting used to the new interface for next year. So before I get too caught up in any of that, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country. And by that, I mean I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra and Biripi peoples of Australia, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which Charles Sturt's campuses are located, and pay my respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging. And we're coming to you today from slightly overcast Wiradjuri land in the shadow of Walu, but maybe that'll pick up in the next couple of days. For those of you having any access issues this morning, I know we've got storms going on across the state, etc. The session's recorded. All of the files that we'll be using today, the artifacts, will be shared with you both in the session, and then there will be an email afterwards where we also provide links to all of those materials. So don't worry if you feel that you've missed out on anything as well. Okay, so where does today's training session sit? In the grand scheme of things, the training for Brightspace follows this continuum, where we had an initial phase where we had early adopters getting into the system and having a bit of an explore themselves, or those people who requested early access. That was kind of badged under this banner of explore. Then in the middle, we have both create and adapt training decks, which basically are around people who are building subject sites from the ground up under create. It's a fairly small number at the uni doing that, probably because of time and everything else. And a very large number of people like yourselves that are dealing with adapt. So that means migrated materials brought across from Interact 2. And the last, which by no means the least important, is the engage training, which will affect all teaching staff at CSU. And that will start rolling out primarily next year. There will be a pilot for that in a couple of weeks. And that basically is around how we use the system to deliver our subjects. And that means all of the tools that you're probably very used to using with Interact 2, how your tutorials are handled, how the communication tool set's handled, how we approach assessment, grading, marking, feedback, that sort of thing. All of our BAU processes for learning and teaching delivery as such. That's all covered under Engage. Adapt and Create focus primarily on content and assessment structures. That's how it's generally organized. The principles underpinning the project, the transition to Brightspace, particularly in terms of the migration team's work on organizing content, are organized under these broad design principles. They're on slide 4. And effectively, I'm sure that you have a number of these principles at heart already in terms of how you approach your learning materials. For example, making sure that it's organized consistently, logically, etc., that it's welcoming, that it's inclusive, that you're trying to foster collaboration, communication, etc. So these are probably codifying principles that you undoubtedly have at heart within your own practice anyhow. What we like to achieve with the ADAPT sessions for the attendees is we really want to help you learn how to effectively navigate the Brightspace interface, particularly with a focus around content proofing and we'll be working within master subject sites, and I'll break down what that means shortly. And also to help with your evolving understanding around the migration process and what that's involved and the work that needs to be done after that process. So that's where the ADAPT A session, this morning's session, focuses on. We'll be looking at that. The second session, B, really gets into a lot more detail around assessment item creation and also the content around assessment that has been migrated across. So that's the second session. And we do have one of those happening today at 12 o'clock. So in terms of how that's organized, we're going to have a look at familiarization with the Brightspace interface. We're going to break down optimization, what that works. Then we get into validation and tweaking of content, and particularly getting into the Brightspace editor and the tool set that you can use to work with your content. All right, so let's start with a little bit of context. And what I'm going to be doing shortly is moving my deck off this screen and working within the system. I will point out periodically which slide I'm vaguely keeping track of on the right as I start navigating through the system. So I'm just going to have a look at some terminology, which is on slide 8. And I'll move that across onto another screen so we can start talking about things. If you need me to share the slide deck again in the chat, I'm happy to do so. Just point that out and either myself or Amy can do that. The first thing you need to be aware of with Brightspace is accessing the system, and that happens through a single sign-on portal, SSO. And if you go to the address learn.csu.edu.au, it will bring you to this page. Do not be fooled by this username password area. That's not for us. We click on the single sign-on and it'll ask for your work credentials and take you straight into the system. So that's the first thing, getting into single sign-on and seeing that acronym in there, SSO. When you join Brightspace for the first time, you're taken into what's referred to as the Brightspace homepage or the system homepage. And that will show all of the subjects that you have access to through a couple of mechanisms, one of them being what's called a My Subjects widget. So each of these areas that you can see on the page here are widgets, and that basically means that they're a shortcut to another tool or another function. So we have an announcement widget. If you've got any announcements happening, they'll be captured in there. We've got a staff links widget. We've got a calendar widget, a learning object repository widget. I'll get into the LOR a little bit later on. And importantly, we also have all of the subjects that you have access to with this thumbnail view underneath My Subjects. Pardon me. And so what you're getting within that is the ability to filter that view by things like if they're organization sites, if they're master subject sites, we'll come up with a distinction between master subjects and session subjects. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. But effectively, what we're getting on our first page when we enter the system, our home page, is that we are given access to subjects, but we're not taken into the subjects yet. So that you basically have to navigate your way into the individual subjects you want. You're also going to hear reference to the term Brightspace Nav or navigation. It's referring to this black menu across the top of the page. That's the nav, and the nav changes between being in a subject site and being in the system homepage. So at the moment, when we first enter the system, we get access to Discover, subject outlines. You'll see a link up the top there, and some help options. And then above the nav, we have a couple of other options. One of them being the Charles Sturt University icon at the top here is a shortcut that will always bring you back to the system homepage. So if you ever want to jump back, you can click on the logo here, it'll take you back. If we move across, this section here is referred to as the mini bar. And the minibar has a few other interesting options available to you. One of them being this little square collection of squares icon. This is called the waffle. You'll see that referred to in that terminology slide, but the waffle is effectively a subject selector. And basically what that will allow you to do is not only same thing as these thumbnails. If you wanted to navigate your way through each of the thumbnails that are available there, you can actually find those subjects by searching within the waffles, starting to type it in. You can pin the ones that you wish to remain at the top using the pins on the side. So that's going to be handy, particularly the more subjects you get access to. You'll notice here, for example, I've got access to some sandboxes as well as master subject sites, which is where that M dash comes into play before the subject code. And then we also find underneath, there's some here that have an S dash before the subject code, followed by a session number. And this tells me that this is a session subject site as opposed to a master subject site. So that first letter before the name or the code for the subject is quite indicative of what sort of site it is. So we will be doing a lot of talking about master subject sites versus session subject sites. I might just close Teams so that we don't get any more pop-ups while I'm doing this. So the other thing that we get within the mini bar at the top here is there is a bell, which is a notification alert or an update alert. And that really will, it's not necessarily going to flow through to your emails, for example, unless you adjust your notification settings. But you can always click on update alerts and it'll tell you whether any content has been created, whether there have been any student submissions, etc. All of the activity within your sites is captured within that update alerts area. Moving across to the right, where your name will be, your profile, if you click on that, you'll have notifications here that you can configure how they behave. And the moment that you start turning those on for each different type of activity under notifications, it'll ask you how you want to be notified, SMS or email for any of these things. So at some point, you'll need to go through that and decide whether or not you want to receive notifications or not. You'll see here, I have all of mine off at the moment. I'm just playing it a little bit carefully because I don't want to be inundated with email messages and what have you about system updates. So I'm still thinking about how I'm going to work with my notifications. However, this is an opportunity to talk about the Brightspace mobile app, which is called Pulse, which I would strongly advise you to download from the iOS store or the Google store as well, the Play Store. It will effectively take care of this notification aspect and allow you to get those on your phone, depending on which ones you would like or not like, rather than getting email messages at the drop of a hat. So the notifications area underneath the profile is important, but far and away the most important aspect of the mini bar is your ability to switch to a student view, which is the viewer's learner option. And you'll be doing this a lot as part of the validation process with your content, wanting to make sure that you understand that there is a difference between how instructors can see content in Brightspace and what that experience ultimately looks like for students as they view it. So you'll be jumping up here to your profile and switching to viewer's learner. And then you'll see underneath your name, you're now looking at the system homepage as a learner. And similarly, once we jump into subject sites in a moment, you'll see that there is a significant difference in that view. To jump out of the student view, the learner view, click again on the same area, and then you can hit the cross, and this will reset you back to your instructor view. So we're really, we focused on the system homepage, the Brightspace homepage. I'm now going to jump into some subject sites. If I have a look, for example, at this one. And what we're looking at now within the subject site, I'll start at the top. We've got our icon that will take us back to the Brightspace homepage. We've got a subject code here at the top, as well as the name of the subject, and it is also a shortcut which will bring you back to this page, the subject homepage, whenever you want to jump back here. You don't have to worry about using back arrows in your browser or finding some other option to go back. You can always click on the name of the subject. It'll bring you back to the subject homepage. You'll notice straight away that the nav within the subject up the top has changed. And that's because we now have a number of subject-specific options. As instructors, we get course admin. If we open course admin, this will give you really a back-end view of all of the options or functions that you can choose within the subject site. Some of them you'll see refer to things like your ability to work on assessment or working with your students, your class lists, etc., attendance. There are some communication tools. So they're sorted underneath these different names or categories, if you will. But all of those can be accessed. If you can't find something that you're looking for, maybe go into course admin and you should be able to find it in there. Sometimes the options that you're looking for aren't perhaps where you would expect them to be. So I would suggest as a fallback, you get used to jumping into course admin and looking for things there. Moving along, we've then got our content option, content tool. And if we open that up, it will give us a files and folders view of all of the content within the subject site. Now, I would stress again, this is not how students experience content within Brightspace. This is how instructors can see it. And each of these folders, with each of the files within them or items within them, is collapsible. You can open them up and have a look at them. And you'll notice that some of them will have an eye with a line through it, which refers to the visibility of the item. When content is published by default in Brightspace, when you make new content, it is invisible to students. And that visibility toggle will always be found here at the top. You see a button to toggle visibility, but also there's a visual indicator for you in this files and folders view. So when we're having a look at our content as an instructor, what we can see here is as our top level folders, individual files that have been brought in underneath. And if we scroll down, we'll see more of them. And in this case, they're using the topic labeling convention for potentially for each of the weeks within the subject. And each of those can be expanded out. Down the bottom here, we've got some hidden folders. These are assessment folders, and I'm going to talk about why they're hidden and what that means for you working with a migrated subject site shortly. But we're looking at our instructor view of the content. And this view, just in case you're not entirely across that difference between the student view and the instructor view, if we change now to viewing as learner by clicking on the profile, view as learner, what we're going to see here now, the students have a subject landing page that gives them these thumbnails, a representation of each of the topic folders within the subject. So this is a widget, a My Topics widget, that will allow them to jump directly into individual topics or folders. You can see that the student landing page in the subject has an announcement widget, a calendar widget, work to do, upcoming activities sort of thing, a widget for that as well. So anything that has a due date in the system will also be appearing here for them. And also an activity feed widget. We're not touching on that too much today in the Adapt A session, but I just wanted to point out that the widgets and the view for students, particularly once we start getting into content, is quite different. So they can use the My Topics widget to jump into content. They can also click in the nav under content. And what we're going to see now is our first major difference in the view. The student view of content opens up like this with a collapsible view of all of the topics within the subject, visible topics, not invisible topics. And what we're going to see is unpacking each of those, we're able to launch that content, which will open up the first item within the folder. This is a title. And up the top here, we have another one of our terms from our terminology slide called a hamburger menu. Is the nickname for this. And now what we have for students is the ability to jump between individual items within the content. So if you're missing that from Blackboard, your ability to jump between items from the student view, we still have it within Brightspace. It's from that hamburger menu option, which means that you can either scroll left and right using these arrows, moving through the content. You can see that content within Brightspace is very, very clean in terms of how it presents. There's a checklist that they have within this. We'll talk more about checklists as content items for you. But they can move through each of those objects, or they can use the hamburger menu to jump between content as well. Students can either print the content directly from this screen, or they can download, which will give them a HTML file. And what you're going to see within Brightspace for both the student and the instructor views is they have a number of progression aids or visual indicators of progression. So you can see up here, it's telling me that Lachlan, the student, for example, has visited 6 out of 10 of these content items. And in terms of the number of topics, it's referring to them up here as units. I'm in number 3 out of 18. And if I was to jump back to my landing page by clicking on the subject icon, I also get that indication of progress here in a number of other ways, a percentage marker of how much of the content I've worked through, or how many topics within this particular subfolder. So this is where it's probably important that I talk a little bit about terminology and not being thrown by the labels that we have within Brightspace. What I want to get at there is that you're going to see this use of the term topic by Brightspace. If I open this up, I'm still looking at this as a learner. Let me take off the learner view. When we go into our content view, we can see this word unit here up the top. Now, I don't want you to be thrown by this. What it's referring to is the top level folder to organize content within Brightspace. The fact that it says unit is in no way an indication of what you should be thinking this is for. It's simply just a top level folder. There may be changes to the language pack over time in this system so that it aligns a bit more with what we're used to. But what I'm telling you at this point is when you're looking at your subject sites that have been migrated and you see this term unit, all it's referring to is this top level folder that we can see here, top layer. And within those, if we open up some of these folders, some of them, for example, may have a subfolder within them. So if I went to add a new, and it's referring to it here as a lesson, this is where it gets a little confusing. They're not lessons, they're just subfolders. So I really want to stress that it's important that you don't be thrown too much by the terms that they're using in here, units, lessons, etc. You can call these objects whatever you want when you add them. It's just simply a way of referring to top level folders and subfolders within the system. I'm going
We
to
have a
stop there.
question in the chat. Yes, good timing.
Go
We
ahead.
have a question in the chat from Marissa.
Mm-hmm.
So, Marissa's wondering, are progress indicators only activated by student presence in the item, or can the student actively control what they have or have not completed? As there's a difference between visiting an item and engaging.
Yeah, look, it's a good question, Marissa. I would say, obviously, from our point of view, there is a big difference between just having visited a page and having completed something. But in terms of those visual indicators, in the first instance, it's simply showing that they've been to that page.
Okay.
There are other ways that we can work on, I guess, providing an indication that something has been done. So if you're familiar, for example, in Interact 2 with that mark as red or that sort of functionality,
I use that all the time. Yeah.
there are ways that we can accomplish that as well.
Okay, cool.
I'll probably get back to you on that.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yep. Okay, so I mentioned looking still at our terminology slide here a little bit. I'm referring back to it. We talked a little bit about the difference between instructor and learner views. The hamburger menu, for example, how important that is for students and for instructors, really jumping between items. The fact that they're talking here about units, for us, we'd probably refer to them more as modules or folders. They've got this word lessons in there. They're not really lessons. They're simply just a subfolder or submodule. The main unit for building content or pages within Brightspace is this term, HTML document. It simply means a blank page. You don't have to know anything about coding or anything like that. It's just their word for a blank content page. And most of your content, when it gets migrated across from a subject site in Blackboard, will be in that form. Any content item from Blackboard will have been moved across as a page, and that's what the icon looks like there. And this is how it views to us as instructors. So I'll be using that term quite a bit, either HTML page or a new content page within Brightspace. All right, I'm going to give you a link. You may or may not choose to use this link, but effectively, if any of the terms that are put onto that sheet that we were looking at a minute ago, that terminology sheet, you don't feel have adequately addressed some of the new terms that you're hearing today, I would like to get as many as possible in there. So I'll leave the link there for you. It's on slide. What slide am I up to here? 9, roughly. Let's go with 8. So if you come across any other terms in here that you're unsure about, then by all means, just add them to that Menti for me and I'll get to them either in this or subsequent sessions or in communications back to you. Okay, let's keep going. We did jump a little between system homepage and a subject homepage, not to mention the Brightspace entry screen. The last bit that I want to talk about as a resource for you as new users to this system is the Brightspace community of learners. And the link to that is on slide 10 in the deck. If I can just open that, I will. And this page is quite invaluable, certainly has been for me as someone new into this system. You'll need to sign up for it. Doesn't like me at all. Maybe CSU, let's try that. And particularly because it has a series of self-guided training modules that for me are more like a reference or a glossary almost that I can jump into for instructors. And that will actually take you into different types of functionality that you might want to learn about. If they're not covered in training sessions that I've run, for example, or you want to just jump ahead to particular areas, then I really would suggest that you join this particular element of the community, the guided training for instructors. And you'll see it's built within Brightspace. The interface is the same. You can jump into any of these chapters, if you will. They're just module folders. And you can start looking at some of those functionality areas that you might be interested in, like creating advanced topics or topics. So if they're not covered in a training session that you've attended, by all means, come in and have a look here in the guided training that's provided by the vendor themselves. Okay. Now we'll get into the business of looking at master subject sites, I think, before this takes forever to load. All right, I'm looking at slide 12 for the curious. Now, I pointed out right at the beginning the difference in the naming convention between a master subject site, where it has the M- and the subject code. Then we have session subject sites, which will be marked by the S- and the session afterwards. What I want to point out is the difference in purpose between those two things. What we're dealing with mostly in the ADAPT sessions is around preparation within the master subject site. When we get into the engage training later on, that's working on delivery within session subject sites. The master site will never have any students in it. It is a pristine, version controlled, iteration of your subject that is meant to be the most current, up-to-date version of the subject that will then get pushed out session after session after session to session subject sites. All the content is visible to you because you are instructors, subject conveners, etc. within those sites. The idea is that we populate all of the assessments for the session subject sites in here within the master. It doesn't have a grade center as such, a grade book. That's a term used in Brightspace, grade book. And we don't have any data going in there around how users are using the master site. Its entire reason for being is having that pristine version of the subject available, so we don't have to continually create them afresh. if you will. It will always be up to date and then pushed out automatically. If you've got a subject running in 30, 60, 90, etc., the cell will tell the system, right, that this is running, MKT 110 is running in 60. We need to push it out, and it will do so. So that's why we're focusing predominantly on the master subject sites in ADAPT. And what happens with those, for those of you working with migrated subject sites, is they take all of the content from within Interact 2. And if I can open up a subject just to remind you, I'm sure you don't need a reminder about what I2 looks like. However, I'm going to do it anyway. Let's just take one of these. Everything that sits within Interact 2 along the left-hand side in our navigation bar is effectively folders and files, content. Everything is made available within Blackboard as content, if you will, within this menu, whether it's assessment related, whether they're communication tools, whether they're learning materials somewhere, whether they're third-party tools like Zoom, etc. Everything is captured within Blackboard effectively as content within content areas. The main difference that we have working within Brightspace is we'll migrate across all of that content. However, you've got to make some decisions as an instructor in this new system about what is actually learning materials and what has to go somewhere else now. And I'll break that down for you shortly. But there is a tool that will help you do this, and I'm going to share it in the chat now. And that is called the Migration Equivalence Table. Now I'll open that up here as well on my screen. Don't want to print it, just want to open it. Okay. Now what you're going to get in this document, if I zoom in a little, is it's going to look at every one of the items that you previously had within your Interact 2 sites along the left. Did they sit within your menu in Blackboard? What's happening to them in terms of content within Brightspace? Is it coming across, for example, the welcome area or the home page from I2? It is, but we may need to read across here on the right. Brightspace, the first folder in the system, is renamed as welcome. The first folder within your subject sites must be called welcome, and it will capture information that was on your homepage previously, like the abstract for the subject if you had it, potentially if you had contact details, etc., or the names of the conveners or the markers, other things, that will have been captured by the migration team and put into that welcome area within Brightspace, as opposed to the getting started area from Blackboard, which is no longer being brought across. But if it has information in it that you feel might have value within the welcome area, you can certainly repurpose it and add it in there in that welcome folder. The subject outline content area no longer exists within Brightspace. It's in the menu. We have it in our menu up the top, and I'll show you where that is. The subject evaluation survey previously in Blackboard was a content item, a link to something over on the left-hand side with all those other folders. It doesn't exist like that in Brightspace. It's part of our navigation. So what I'm telling you that you need to do here is that you've got to have a look through each of these items if you're not sure if they're being brought across or not, or if you have to do anything with them. Refer to this migration table if you're unsure. Far and away the most important of those, from my point of view, is the assessment folders that would have existed within your Interact 2 site. If you had any content within them, it's not going to be made available by default to students as part of their learning materials. And if I can go back to my subject site, I'll tell you exactly what I'm talking about there. If I can find a subject site, that would be great. Okay, if I look at the content that's come across in the master subject site for MKT 241, the first thing that you're going to get within your migrated subject site is a message from the migration team. It sits up here, read first, it's hidden, post-migration. And this message, if we open it up, will provide you with this report, a migration report that talks about the migration team's workflow for having brought content across, which subject site they brought it from, what's needed to happen, and anything that you need to look at following on. From my perspective so far, the first 3 or 4 of these items are in every one of these reports. So you're going to see them in one, you'll see them in a number of them. Once you're getting into 5 and 6, for example, they're starting to get a bit more specific. So if you've got 7 or 8 or 9 items in your migration report, arguably from number 5 onwards are the ones that are specifically going to be saying within your subject site, these are things you might need to look at. And in many cases, it's referring to things like problems with links or subfolders, for example. Brightspace really will only let you have one layer of subfolder underneath the top level folder. If I can open up a nursing subject, I'll explain exactly what I'm getting at, because they certainly do. Nursing, NRS, there we go. So when I say top level folder and subfolder, this is what I mean. This is our top level folder, one layer. If we open up one of these modules, we'll see they have 3 subfolders. That's your second layer. If you add additional subfolders underneath inside these, they're not going to be viewable to students through the mobile app. That's why we say don't add a 3rd layer of subfolders, keep it to 2 in terms of how your content is organized. And you may very well have a message in your migration report telling you about that. If you previously had 3 and 4 and other levels of folders within folders within folders, there may be a message in your migration report telling you about why they've either been removed or that you'll need to make changes to them. Okay, so the migration outcome, the report is there for you as your first item. It does mention that when you've actually finished going through the report and actioned any of the items they've pointed out, that you should either delete or move this folder out of the way. And the way that we do that in Brightspace, once you're finished with it, you'll find over on the right-hand side with any of your content, you'll see an options, 3 dots, and you can delete from there. If you're feeling a little uncomfortable about doing that, you can simply use these handlebars to the left of the item and drag it out of the way, right down the bottom. Your students will not see it because the visibility is toggled. Invisible, hidden. So that's the first folder item that's going to require your attention in dealing with a migrated subject site. The next one on the list that is visible is that welcome folder that I mentioned when we looked at the equivalence table a second ago. And if we look at that, within the folder, we have 2 pages that have been brought across. And you'll see that they've got a general welcome or introduction to the subject. In this case, an infographic that's been brought in there, a quote. These are all things that you probably have seen from your home pages in Blackboard as well. But you'll have some discretion, obviously, over what you want to put in. And certainly whether or not you want there to be multiple items within the welcome. I'm going to jump sideways a little bit and talk about the welcome in slightly more detail here, because there is a tool within Brightspace called the welcome widget. And if I jump into QA, I'll give you a look at what this looks like. Let's find any other subject. Would open up ICCP. Now, the welcome widget effectively does this to students, to first-time users of the subject site. It opens up the content within that welcome folder for them the first time they enter the site from the home page. This will be put in front of them and they need to actually navigate through it before they're then able. This one's got 3 pages within it, for example. They've got to scroll through to the 3rd page before you're then able to dismiss it and never see it again. So think about what kind of content you want the student to see before they start engaging with the learning materials or anything else, because this widget will force them to look at it the first time they enter the site. If that means your contacts, etc., your sort of protocols around communication or important messaging that you want them to see before they do anything else, put it in the welcome folder because it will be put in front of them through this widget. You can always come back and relaunch it from the homepage, the subject homepage, if you wish, or it will be that first folder within the content that they can go back to in the student view as well. So there's a couple of ways, but the welcome widget puts it front and center. And I believe that that's also spoken about in that slide deck, which I've probably hidden now, have I?
Slide 20.
Yeah, I was getting caught in tabs within tabs within tabs. Okay, so that's the welcome widget. We talked a little bit about the subject migration report, the feedback that you get from the migration team, and the fact that you're going to get some instruction in there around whether you need to look at things like problems with images or hyperlinks.
We have a question from Beta around that welcome as well.
Excellent. That's a good time for me to stop and get a drink. What's the question?
So if the welcome disappears after their first use, you would need to have your contact details stated on another page. They can see it as a
couple of
page.
answers. Yeah, so they're seeing a preview of the page, so to speak, through the widget. So they see all the content within that widget as a pop-up when they go into the subject site on the landing page, but it's also visible as content pages within the welcome area. And particularly with contact details, first and foremost, that information will always be captured within the subject outline. And that kind of habit for students to be referring as a source of truth for all information about the subject to the subject outline remains. That's still where we'll be directing them to.
And another question from Mark. Can the welcome widget be session-based rather than on the master subject?
Okay, there's a couple of ways to answer this. What I'm going to say is, if you create a version within the master that you're happy with as a generic form, that will be pushed out each session. If you modify it to contain specific session-based information, so for example, coming into your content and your welcome items and putting information in here that is session-based, that's fine, but you're going to need to remember that it has to be modified the next time that the subject gets pushed out.
You can do it on the subject site level as well.
Or you can do it in the subject site, exactly as Amy has said. Once the master has been pushed out, we looked up here at M- for the master version versus Lachlan, S-, here we go. The session subject site, I could come into the content here and modify the welcome content in this folder specifically for this session. Job done at that point. That's not going to impact the master in any way. So keep the master version generic, for lack of a better term, if you can, and make session-based modifications here would be my advice. That's a really good question, Mark. I'm going to continue with a pause for a moment there. Would anyone else like to come off mute, add in any comments, questions, or other things at this stage before we move on? Go ahead.
Just another thing. So if there's master sites and session sites,
yep,
does that mean that if you have, let's say, a CSU, an online offering, and you've got a Wagga offering and an Albury offering with different coordinators, they will each have their own site that could be different?
Okay, so the way that cohorts are dealt with within Brightspace, there will always be one single subject site, right? So it doesn't create a different version of the subject site per se for each different cohort. The cohorts are dealt with using a tool called sections. And what that means is that within this page, within your master subject site, once it gets pushed out into the session, it will pick up from our other databases where the students are coming from, which different cohorts. And then things like assessment and content, if you wish it, can then be provisioned to specific cohorts if you need it to be. It's all still happening within the one subject site, within the session subject site. The master is just your single pristine version before it gets distributed, so to speak, into that iteration for the session. So don't be, what I'm saying here is ignore this cohort marker that's here. It shouldn't be there. We don't have a separate page only for BD. We have a session subject site for 2023-60. That's what we get. Within that subject site, things like the assessment items and the content, the discussion forums can all be selectively directed to be visible only by particular cohorts if you want them to be. Right? That's part of the setup or the tweaking that you can do in the individual session subject site. You don't do it within the master.
So on my menu, if I'm the convener and I want to say to the coordinator in Wagga, look, you're not going to be using the discussion board because you're meeting them every week, I have a tool then in the master site to suppress that part of the site as it'll appear on the Wagga session site.
So there's no Wagga session site. There'll be a session site for session 30, session 60, session 90. You may have Wagga students in there, Bathurst students, other distance students, whatever. All the cohorts will be in the same site, but within the tool itself, things like individual forums or posts, you can direct them to only be visible to certain cohorts. So you would hide those within the session site, not the master.
Okay, so there's some tool on the master site that allows me to selectively allow different cohorts to see different parts of the master site.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yep. So effectively, you would use things like release conditions against content. That's the way that you would do it, and you release by cohort, by section.
Okay.
I actually have a quick guide in the works that I will distribute once it's finished around doing exactly that as well. I can share that. All right, let's keep going. I am aware that time is running away from us, and there is always so much more within this tool than what I can cover within the time. We talked a little bit about the welcome widget. I think it's time that we had a look at the content editor and what that looks like for people. For this, I'm going to actually jump into my own sandbox so I can start building things for you. So in here as an instructor, I'm jumping into my content area. You can see here I've got a number of top level folders, or unit as this term is. If I wanted to add another, I could just click on new unit. Another top level folder. I'm just creating that in there. It's hidden by default down the bottom. I'll unhide it. I'll click save and close. There it is there. At the moment, that folder is empty. Clicking on it, I have no other items within. Some of the others here with arrows next to them, you can see I can uncollapse those, and I have subfolders, and then within those, I've got different items. Whenever you're adding additional content, if you want to move it around, you simply move to the left and use the handlebars to drag it either into other folders or change the order of the objects if you wish. If I wanted to add new pages of content into this tool, I can do that using Create New up here. If I wanted to add a new blank page, I would be clicking on this HTML document option, giving it a title, and then starting to work with the editor, the Brightspace editor. And this is another tool from our terminology slide. The slang term for the editing toolbar within these tools is called a WYSIWYG, which stands for what you see is what you get. So if you ever hear someone talking about the WYSIWYG, it simply means the editing toolbar within it. So in this case for Brightspace, it has what you would expect, formatting options, etc., around font and other things, alignment, bullets, but it also has this tool called Insert Stuff. And the Insert Stuff option allows us to bring in third-party content like Panopto content, for example. We can bring in files and folders from elsewhere. We can upload them from our computer. We can add things like YouTube and other options in here. Hyperlinks, if you're using embed code from other tools like Mentimeter, H5P, Padlet, etc., they can all still be embedded within the content. And I can see someone's got a question in there about Padlet integration. I'll get to that in just a second. We also have a tool here that talks about a video note. And the video note tool basically is going to turn on your webcam and your headset and may allow you to make content on the spot, either audio only or video content. You can see I can toggle audio only and add those directly to the content item if you wish. Or the alternative would be to use other tools like Panopto. If you've previously made content within Panopto, you can add it directly in here as well. You can browse for that. The learning object repository, the learning repository is another term we had on our terminology slide, and it is effectively a storage space for learning objects that you wish to share across subjects with your cohort, with your colleagues, sorry. It's an open repository for all other teaching staff, which means that if you want things to go into not only your other subject sites, but other people to have access to, you can share them within the learning object repository. You're also able to continue using tools like DOMs. If you've got copyright protected content that would traditionally sit within DOMs, slides, images, etc., you can put it within there and then hyperlink it into your learning materials in Brightspace. And I think at that point, I'll jump to that question around Padlet, for example. What was happening there, Amy?
Sorry, the question? Yeah,
yes,
I can
please.
read that. Oh, well, Marissa would love to do a subject on fluffy cats, which
Excellent.
I'm all about that. That's fine. I can help. And she's noticed that on the Padlet integration, if I use my Padlet to do welcome messages each week, is this possible to integrate into the welcome widget?
Okay, I'll talk first about whether it's possible, and the answer is yes, because the welcome widget is just a folder with pages on it. The pages have access to that same editing tool set, to the WYSIWYG, which means that you can use insert stuff and embed the code from Padlet. So is it functionally possible? Absolutely.
Is there a better way?
The announcement tool would be partly
Okay.
where I would be going, because it appears on the landing page and they get notifications for
Yep.
it.
Yep. I figured there's probably another tool to use. It's a bit clunky going back and forward between Padlet and i2. So yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really get too much into those embedded third-party kind of tools in particularly in this training session, but my take on them is wherever there's a use case where you want collaboration amongst students within the learning materials, they've still got real value. But in terms of trying to maybe accomplish other communicative type functions, there's better tools within Brightspace.
Great. Yeah, thanks.
And we have a question from Warwick, and he wants to know if this is where we can bring in Strive content. So
Strive is being rebuilt within Brightspace, is my understanding, as actual learning modules, for example, using this content, rather than from where it traditionally sat within online learning. What was that platform called? Open Learning? I can't
Open
remember.
Learning, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's being rebuilt within as Brightspace subjects themselves, Warwick.
Then the hope is that those Strive learning modules will be able to be linked to your subject sites as well once that's built out.
Yeah, well, if they're built as content items within here, they'll absolutely be able to be quick linked to.
That's Kat's plan
places.
that I hear. And then from Ali, should our Panopto recordings be available yet, or is the transfer still a work in progress?
That's a really, really good question. Okay. Panopto is a slightly tricky scenario, and I'm not sure if that communication has come out yet around it or if it's coming out at the end of the week. But effectively, we have a few problems with Panopto at the moment. One being it's changing from using it as a building block tool within Blackboard to being a learning technology integration to being an LTI. So there's a body of work around that. The second part is whether or not you've been using master folders or not, Ali, for your materials, because all content in Panopto has to go into a master folder moving forward rather than session-based folders. And the migration team, what will happen with your subject when it's brought across, will actually take care of the embedding of the Panopto video and pointing back towards where it's coming from at the moment for you as part of the process. And in fact, yep, go ahead.
So they have done that, but it's not really how we need it. And for me to play around and learn, like I'm just practicing uploading, trying to embed a Panopto video. I can see there's a folder there, but there's no content there. So
That's right.
I just know that's going to be the biggest bit of work for us, is managing our lecture notes and recordings. But I can't kind of learn until there's something there to play with.
Okay. So what's happening with it is that there is your pre-existing Blackboard master folder.
Yes.
Which is where those videos will be put in the first instance.
Yes.
There's going to be a new master folder within Brightspace, which is empty at the moment, which is what you're looking at.
Yep.
Right.
Okay.
Now that content will be transitioned across by Panopto and by the migration team. They'll help you with that when we hit the cutoff point, and it'll be moved across. In the first instance, it gets embedded, pointing back to the old master folder content, which is why you can't
that
see
makes
it.
sense. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So I just need to know where I'm heading, and at least I know that I'm choosing the right options to try and add a Panopto recording.
You
If I was to
absolutely
copy
are.
the embed code from where the migration team have put it, would it work?
Don't use embed codes.
Okay.
The reason for that is because you'll be able to view them within the master subject site, but when it gets pushed out each session to your students, they're not going to be able to see it. It doesn't retain the relationships between learner and instructor, etc., in the session sites, unless you use insert stuff and the Panopto tool.
And it goes back to the master folder.
And you've got to point it to the right master folder and the right video. That's how it retains those relationships.
Okay.
I know it's overly complex, but yeah, I'm happy to talk with you more about the Panopto situation with that if you like at another time.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So Mark, is there a preferred way for us to check the contact post-migration? Content. All right, sorry. A preferred way. Well, you need to certainly work through all of the visible files and folders that are there within the subject site, and make sure that the links are working, the videos are playing, the images are doing what you expect them to do. If there's anything that's standing out that shouldn't be there. So you definitely have to basically review it all in terms of making sure that it displays properly both in the instructor and the learner view. So navigating through the content as a learner is a must, to make sure that it's displaying properly, that the videos are playing, etc., if you've got video content. The other thing that you really have to do is, if you've got content folders which have been brought across and hidden, and we have here on this page a selection of old Blackboard folders, whether it's assessment folders, online tutorial meeting recordings, that folder that's been brought across, etc. None of these are going to be made available to students within Brightspace. The intention is assessment information will be provisioned in assessment areas via the assessment menu in the nav. We certainly talk about that more in this afternoon session, which is Adapt B, around that. But content within them has to be taken out of here and provisioned somewhere else, either in a discussion forum, within an assessment item, description or instructions, other areas. Because keeping those visual progression markers in mind that we saw before, how many topics you've finished, which unit you've worked through, etc., we need the materials that are available to students underneath content to actually be learning materials, as opposed to support information, extra materials, additional information, other resources, all that kind of stuff. They really need to be quite carefully reviewed with that in mind. Now, I'm aware we're almost at time, Amy, or we are at time, I should say.
We are. I know that Lockie's happy to stick around, but if anybody does need to leave, I'm sure it's completely understandable.
Yeah, I'll keep recording as well if you need to take off and send the link to that recording. But I've probably got about another 5 or 10 minutes of things I'd like to talk about for a minute. So if you're happy to stay for that, then great. But I would like to point out a couple more things to you. Within the editing tool set that we have, and looking at the WYSIWYG within Brightspace, there is a plus icon here that you're going to see that actually opens up a couple of very neat additional functions within this system that you wouldn't have had before. One of them is insert practice, and a practice is referring to an interactive activity that requires information from the user, from the student. So if you think about activities like multiple choice, fill in the blanks, close activities, etc., you can create that sort of interactive directly within the system using a practice. And it means you can also get user data within Brightspace, learning analytics, because it's been built within Brightspace. The other option that we have within here is also the insert element option. And the difference between them is elements are interactives that simply reorganize information. So if you look at things that we might have been doing previously in H5P or other tools like using accordions or click and reveal areas for your content, etc., or flip cards, etc., if you wanted to create that sort of interactive content directly within your learning materials now without having to use a third-party tool like H5P or Padlet, etc., you don't have to use those tools necessarily. You can use tools native to Brightspace, and they are extremely easy to use with
It
the
looks so
added benefit.
fancy.
It's fancy, and you get for me, the best part is you get the data around the learners, what they're using, what they're not using, how they're accessing it. So those two functions are available underneath that plus icon within the WYSIWYG here. We also have access within this tool to an accessibility checker within the content. If you look within the WYSIWYG, there is an eye with a tick underneath it. This is a native tool that will allow you to check over the text and the content. If I find some text here, turn on my editor.
Yes.
And click on the checker. It's telling me you've got images in here that don't have descriptions, and I can fix those. I can add alt text or descriptions to them, or I can mark them as decorative. You can work through those different issues underneath. It doesn't like ratio around some of the text, might have a problem with some of the infographics, but you have an accessibility checker tool directly within the Brightspace editor itself. Ally, I believe, will also more than likely be coming across for us to continue using if you want to run an accessibility report on the entire subject site. If you've been using Ally in Blackboard, I think it will be available again. It's not turned on currently in production, however. So that's worth keeping in mind. And the very last thing before I let you go is when we run the Engage training, I know that I've said this, the second session this afternoon is another part of Adapt where we look at assessment shells. When we move into the Engage training in a few weeks, we start looking at that information that we use for our business as usual processes within session subject sites. Today, we've been looking at master sites. Engage looks at session sites and how we use the tools that are in those sites like Zoom, Panopto, Leganto, those tools, and also how we approach our grading assessment and feedback workflows. Those are arguably two fairly critical areas of our delivery, but also how we utilize the communication tool set like announcements and discussions and deal with cohorts and sections, for example. Bede, I know you were interested in that earlier. All right, and I've gone over time, but we will provide all of the artifacts that we've used today in the session to you via email after this as well. And if you're coming this afternoon, I'll see you then. Thanks, everybody. I'll stop the recording there, but if you want to hang around and ask me any other questions, I'm happy to stick around.